But, it's a castle, Patricia sputtered, her voice cracking with desperation. It's ridiculous. Yes, Mr. Henderson replied with a sigh. It is, but it's also legal. Even her attempt to bring in the local historical society backfired. Patricia had hoped to get them to condemn the castle as historically inaccurate. Instead, they declared it a whimsical tribute to medieval architecture and asked to include pictures in their next newsletter. My backyard shed was the epitome of unremarkable. It was a standard prefab model from the local hardware store, made of that ubiquitous faux wood plastic siding that's supposed to look rustic, but mostly just looks plastic. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. It housed the usual collection of suburban paraphernalia: a lawnmower, gardening tools, a few bags of fertilizer, some half-empty cans of paint, and a box of tangled Christmas lights that I swore I'd organize next year. It was tucked away in a corner of the yard, partially hidden by a couple of overgrown rose bushes, which, I later learned, were also a violation of HOA guidelines. It wasn't much, just a standard prefab shed from the local hardware store. It held my gardening tools, the lawnmower, some old Christmas decorations, the usual suburban detritus. It certainly wasn't a thing of beauty, but it served its purpose. Apparently, in Yellow Ridge, that was enough to trigger an HOA intervention, I thought, as I rummaged through the shed searching for a misplaced trowel. The shed was a symbol of my somewhat disorganized suburban existence, a repository for the tools and clutter of everyday life. I should have known that any structure, no matter how mundane, could become a battleground in the ongoing war between homeowners and the forces of HOA tyranny. I just didn't realize how quickly, or how absurdly, that battle would escalate. The bright red violation notice, taped to my front door with unnecessary force, was like a declaration of war. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a symbol of HOA overreach, a testament to the power of petty bureaucrats, and a direct challenge to my right to own a slightly dilapidated shed. But before the notice came the knock, the harbinger of HOA doom. Patricia Harding. Picture a woman whose wardrobe consisted entirely of pastel cardigans and sensible shoes, whose spirit animal was a perfectly trimmed boxwood hedge, and whose favorite pastime was enforcing the HOA's endless list of rules and regulations. She was the self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood aesthetics, the queen of conformity, and, unfortunately for me, the head of the Yellow Ridge HOA Architectural Review Committee. She stood on my porch, a clipboard clutched in her hand like a weapon, her expression a mixture of disdain and righteous indignation. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice as sharp and brittle as dry leaves, "I'm afraid I must address a matter of grave concern." She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. "Your shed." "My shed?" I replied, feigning innocence. "What about it?" "It's ugly," she declared, her eyes narrowing. "It's unsightly. It ruins the aesthetics of the neighborhood. It simply does not conform to the community standards." She said community standards, as if they were some kind of sacred, inviolable code. "It must be taken down at once." She practically spat the last two words. The bright red HOA violation notice, taped to my front door, was an eyesore in itself. It screamed non-compliant in bold all-caps letters, as if my humble shed were a public health hazard. The notice detailed the alleged violation: backyard structure, a shed, aesthetic incompatibility. The reasoning, spelled out in excruciating detail, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic pettiness. Apparently, my shed's exterior finish, that is, faded plastic siding, did not harmonize with the surrounding architectural style, that is, beige boxes. Its placement, that is, in my backyard, was deemed inappropriate, and its overall aesthetic impact, that is, its very existence, was considered a detriment to the community's visual appeal. My internal reaction was a mixture of annoyance, frustration, and a growing sense of disbelief. Were these people serious? Was a slightly weathered shed really such a threat to the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity? This was insane, I thought. The notice demanded that I remedy the violation, that is, remove the shed, within 14 days, or face escalating fines and potential legal action. It was signed in a meticulously neat cursive script by Patricia Harding, chairperson, Architectural Review Committee. I tried to reason with Patricia. I explained that the shed was essential for storing my gardening tools and lawnmower. I pointed out that many other houses in the neighborhood had sheds, though, admittedly, most of them were hidden behind fences or strategically placed shrubbery. I even offered to paint the shed a more acceptable color, though the thought of a beige shed made me shudder. I even pointed to Mrs. Gable's collection of gnomes arranged in an unsettling tableau in her front yard. Surely that was an aesthetic crime. "Those are whimsical, Mr. Carter," she scoffed, before returning her attention to my shed. But it was no use. Patricia Harding was not interested in reason, in logic, or in the concept of compromise. She was interested in rules, in regulations, and in enforcing her narrow vision of suburban perfection upon everyone within her reach. The shed, in her mind, was a symbol of defiance, a challenge to her authority, and it had to go. I decided to take a walk to cool off, and hopefully come up with a plan. As I walked past Patricia's house, heading back to my own, I noticed movement to my left. It was old Mr. Henderson, peeking out from behind his curtains, who beckoned me over. He opened his door a fraction. "She got you too, huh?" he whispered. "The shed?" I nodded. Mr. Henderson sighed. "Join the club. Just be careful. She's relentless." He glanced nervously up and down the street. "And whatever you do, don't give in easily. Make her work for it." I stood in my backyard, staring at the offending shed, the HOA's violation notice crumpled in my hand. I could comply, of course. I could dismantle the shed, haul it away, and return my backyard to its previous state of HOA-approved emptiness. But something inside me rebelled. This wasn't just about a shed. It was about principle. It was about the right to own property, to store my belongings without being harassed by a power-hungry, aesthetically obsessed busybody. If Patricia and the HOA were so obsessed with aesthetics, with controlling every detail of the neighborhood's appearance, then I'd give them something they couldn't control. I'd give them something so unexpected, so audacious, so utterly un-Patricia-like, that it would make her perfectly coiffed hair stand on end, I thought. A new idea, bold and wonderfully ridiculous, beginning to take shape in my mind. A miniature medieval castle. It was absurd, of course, but it was also perfect. It was technically a shed, or at least it had been a shed. It was a way to exploit the HOA's lack of foresight, their failure to anticipate the sheer, unadulterated pettiness of a homeowner pushed too far. And it was, without a doubt, the most gloriously inappropriate response to Patricia Harding's demand for conformity that I could possibly imagine. It would be a fortress of solitude for my lawnmower. "Patricia Harding, you want a war on sheds? You've got one. Prepare to be castle-ized," I declared internally, a surge of defiant energy coursing through me. It was time to escalate. It was time to fight back. It was time to build a castle. My transformation from mild-mannered homeowner to medieval architect began, as most acts of suburban rebellion do, with the internet. I needed to immerse myself in the world of castles, to learn the language of battlements and turrets, to channel the spirit of William the Conqueror, but with, less conquering and more petty revenge. My browser history went from garden shed storage solutions to medieval castle architecture and where to buy miniature gargoyles in record time. I chuckled as I scrolled through pages of castle designs, historical texts, and surprisingly detailed websites dedicated to recreating medieval structures. I focused on smaller castles, gatehouses, and fortified towers, looking for inspiration, for design elements that I could incorporate into my own, slightly less imposing structure. I learned about crenellations, machicolations, and the importance of a well-placed portcullis, which I decided would be a bit much even for me. I studied the use of stone, timber, and iron, the techniques for creating a convincing, if miniature, medieval aesthetic. I started sketching out my plans, filling notebooks with drawings of turrets, battlements, and arched doorways. My initial vague notion of a castle-themed shed was rapidly evolving into something far more elaborate, far more detailed, far more ridiculous. A mischievous grin spread across my face as I refined my designs. This wasn't just about defying Patricia Harding. It was about creating a masterpiece of suburban absurdity, a monument to petty revenge that would stand as a warning to all future HOA tyrants. With my plans finalized, it was time to acquire the necessary materials. This was not a trip to the local hardware store. This was a quest, a pilgrimage to the various suppliers of medieval-themed building supplies, a surprisingly niche market, it turned out. I ordered faux stone panels online, choosing a rustic gray finish that I thought would look particularly imposing. I found a lumberyard that sold rough-hewn timber, perfect for creating a fortified look. I tracked down a blacksmith who specialized in custom ironwork, commissioning him to create a set of heavy-duty hinges and a, mostly decorative, drawbridge mechanism. And then, of course, there were the gargoyles. I found a website that sold a wide variety of gargoyle statues, ranging from the traditionally grotesque to the surprisingly cute. I chose two, relatively small but still menacing-looking creatures with snarling faces and outstretched claws. The deliveries started arriving, a steady stream of boxes, crates, and pallets filled with my medieval arsenal. I had to be discreet, of course. I didn't want Patricia to get wind of my plans before the grand reveal. So I scheduled the deliveries for times when I knew she'd be out. Her weekly power walk and her bi-weekly HOA committee meetings were particularly useful. I'd intercept the delivery trucks, quickly unload the materials, and stash them in my garage, hiding them under tarps and behind stacks of old boxes. It was like being a spy in my own neighborhood, a secret agent of architectural rebellion, preparing for my ultimate act of defiance. The neighbors, of course, were curious. They'd see the trucks, the piles of materials, and they'd ask questions. Just some minor repairs, I'd say, with a vague wave of my hand. Nothing to worry about. The transformation of my humble shed into a miniature medieval castle was a gradual yet dramatic process. It was like watching a time-lapse video of a flower blooming, only instead of a flower, it was a fortress. And instead of blooming, it was becoming increasingly ridiculous. I started by reinforcing the shed's existing walls, adding extra supports and bracing to handle the weight of the faux stone panels. Then came the panels themselves, carefully applied to the exterior, transforming the bland plastic siding into a relatively convincing imitation of ancient stonework. Next, I built the turrets, 4 small cylindrical towers, one at each corner of the shed. They were purely decorative, of course, but they added a touch of architectural flair, a hint of medieval grandeur. I topped each turret with battlements, those iconic, notched parapets that are synonymous with castle design. The drawbridge-style door was the most challenging part of the project. I replaced the existing shed door with a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron studs and fitted with massive wrought iron hinges. I rigged up a simple pulley system, allowing the door to be raised and lowered, with a satisfying thunk, creating the illusion of a functional drawbridge. And finally, I placed the gargoyles. I positioned them on either side of the doorway, their snarling faces glaring out at the world, their stone claws seeming to grip the faux stone walls. They were the guardians of my castle, the silent sentinels of my suburban fortress. The neighbors, as always, were watching. They'd gather at the edge of my property, whispering to each other, pointing and staring. Some were amused, some were bewildered, and some were probably just waiting for the whole thing to collapse. Patricia Harding, of course, was horrified. She'd storm over, her face a mask of fury, and demand to know what I was doing. "Just making some minor repairs, Patricia," I'd reply, with a perfectly innocent smile. "Improving the structural integrity of the shed. You know, safety first." I made sure to use phrases like routine maintenance and necessary upgrades to keep her guessing and infuriated. And then finally it was done. My masterpiece, my monument to petty revenge, my suburban castle. It wasn't a real castle, of course. It was a shed, cleverly disguised as a medieval fortress. But it was also more than that. It was a statement. A declaration of independence, a giant middle finger to the forces of HOA conformity. The faux stone facade, the turrets, the battlements, the drawbridge door, the gargoyles. It all came together to create a surprisingly convincing and utterly ridiculous effect. The flagpole, mounted atop the tallest turret, flew my custom-designed family crest, the garden gnome rampant on a field of beige, naturally. And the flickering LED torch sconce, positioned above the drawbridge, added a final touch of dramatic, medieval ambience. But the pièce de résistance, the detail that truly elevated the project to a new level of petty perfection, was the sign. A handmade wooden sign, carefully painted with Old English lettering, and positioned prominently above the drawbridge entrance. It read in bold, unmistakable letters, Castle Cairnslayer. It was magnificent. It was ridiculous. It was perfect. And it was all completely 100% HOA loophole exploiting, as far as I could tell, I thought, surveying my creation with a mixture of pride and amusement. It was a bold statement, a defiant gesture, and a constant, unavoidable reminder of Patricia Harding's impending doom. The stage was set. The castle was complete. And the battle for suburban supremacy was about to begin. The unveiling of Castle Cairnslayer was a moment I'd been eagerly anticipating, and Patricia Harding's reaction did not disappoint. I'd timed the completion of the project to coincide with her usual morning power walk, ensuring that she'd be among the first to witness my glorious, shed-based fortress in all its medieval splendor. And her reaction? It was operatic. It was a meltdown of epic proportions, a Karen-esque explosion of rage and disbelief that would forever be etched in the annals of suburban legend. She stopped dead in her tracks, her perfectly coordinated pastel tracksuit suddenly seeming wildly out of place against the backdrop of faux stone and wrought iron. Her jaw dropped, her eyes widened, and her face went through a series of colors that I didn't even know were possible. She looked like she'd just stumbled upon an alien invasion, or perhaps a particularly offensive display of improperly placed garden gnomes. Then the screaming started. This is unforgivable, she shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that could shatter glass and probably set off car alarms. She stormed towards my house, her fists clenched, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "You've turned your shed into a medieval fortress. It's an abomination." I emerged from behind one of the turrets, a picture of calm, unruffled composure. "Good morning, Patricia," I said, my voice dripping with feigned politeness. "I see you've noticed my exterior modifications. What do you think?" I was going for a historically inspired look. "Historically inspired?" she sputtered, her face now a shade of purple that I'd previously only seen on overripe eggplants. "We live in suburbia. There's no historical precedent for this." She gestured wildly at the castle, as if it were some kind of monstrous, fire-breathing beast. "It's an architectural statement, Patricia," I corrected her gently. "A tribute to historical design. A celebration of craftsmanship. And, as I'm sure you're aware, decorative landscaping is perfectly permissible under the HOA guidelines." "It's a shed!" she roared, her voice cracking with outrage. "With gargoyles and a drawbridge." She pointed a trembling finger at each offending feature, as if listing the ingredients of a particularly disgusting potion. "The drawbridge is functional, Patricia," I explained. "It enhances security, and the gargoyles are aesthetically pleasing. They add a touch of whimsy." I paused for effect. "Besides," I added with a wink, "the HOA never specified what kind of shed we couldn't have, just that we couldn't leave the old one as it was." Watching Patricia's face contort with rage and disbelief was more satisfying than any perfectly organized tool shed could ever be, I thought, struggling to suppress a laugh. She was practically vibrating with fury, her perfectly coiffed hair threatening to come undone. It was a performance for the ages, a meltdown of epic proportions, and I was enjoying every second of it. Patricia, predictably, called an emergency HOA meeting demanding the immediate removal of Castle Karen Slayer and a complete overhaul of the neighborhood's architectural guidelines. She envisioned a swift condemnation, a unanimous vote to dismantle my fortress, a restoration of order and beige to Sunridge Estates. She was, as usual, in for a rude awakening. The meeting, held in the same beige-walled community center room, was a scene of utter chaos. Patricia, looking increasingly frantic and disheveled, presented a PowerPoint presentation titled "Sheds of Shame: Why Backyard Castles Threaten Our Community." The presentation was a masterpiece of fear-mongering and hyperbole, filled with blurry photos of my castle, exaggerated claims about its negative impact on property values, and a series of increasingly unlikely scenarios. Slide 1. Structural instability. Risk of collapse. With a picture of a cartoon castle crumbling to the ground. Slide 2. Attracting undesirable elements, children. With a picture of kids playing happily around the castle. Slide 3. Violation of aesthetic harmony. With a picture of my castle next to a picture of a perfectly manicured, utterly boring beige house. Slide 4. Historical inaccuracy, a mockery of true medieval architecture. With a picture of a real castle next to a picture of my shed castle. Her arguments were met with a mixture of skepticism, amusement, and outright hostility. The other HOA members, it turned out, were not as enthusiastic about banning castles as Patricia had hoped. Some were secretly impressed by my audacity. Others were simply tired of Patricia's constant complaining, and a few, I suspected, were secretly hoping I'd invite them over for a medieval-themed party. While Patricia fumed and plotted, the rest of the neighborhood was embracing Castle Karen Slayer with open arms. What had started as a source of curiosity and amusement quickly became a point of local pride, a quirky landmark, a symbol of Sunridge Estate's slightly rebellious spirit. Families would stroll by in the evenings, admiring the stone facade, the flickering torchlight, and the fierce-looking gargoyles. Children would pretend to be knights, storming the castle, defending it from imaginary dragons, and generally having the time of their lives. Teenagers started using the castle as a backdrop for their social media posts, posing in front of it, striking dramatic poses, and generally adding to the growing legend of the suburban castle. Even some of the older residents, the ones who'd initially sided with Patricia, started to come around, admitting that the castle was rather impressive and added a certain je ne sais quoi to the neighborhood. The local newspaper, always on the lookout for a good human interest story, ran a feature article titled "The Suburban Castle That Defied the HOA." The article described my castle in glowing terms, highlighting its unique design, its whimsical charm, and its surprisingly positive impact on the community. It included interviews with delighted neighbors, amused city officials, and, of course, a very, very unhappy Patricia Harding. It was a public relations disaster for the HOA, a testament to the power of creativity, and a constant, unavoidable reminder of Patricia's defeat. Patricia, desperate to regain control, tried every trick in the book to force me to dismantle my castle. She cited obscure bylaws, she misinterpreted zoning regulations, she even tried to claim that the gargoyles were offensive and disturbing to children, but it was no use. The HOA's lawyer, the long-suffering Mr. Henderson, a recurring character in my suburban battles, it seemed, was forced to explain yet again that there was nothing they could do. The castle, he pointed out, violated no existing HOA rules. It was on private property. It met all the requirements for a backyard structure, size, height, etc. And most importantly, any attempt to force its removal would likely result in a costly and embarrassing lawsuit. But, it's a castle, Patricia sputtered, her voice cracking with desperation. It's ridiculous. Yes, Mr. Henderson replied with a sigh. It is, but it's also legal. Even her attempt to bring in the local historical society backfired. Patricia had hoped to get them to condemn the castle as historically inaccurate. Instead, they declared it a whimsical tribute to medieval architecture and asked to include pictures in their next newsletter. The HOA meetings became increasingly farcical. Patricia would rant and rave, demanding action, while the other members, increasingly intimidated by me and secretly amused by the situation, would shuffle their feet and look at the ceiling. They'd try to come up with new rules, new regulations, but each attempt was met with a swift and decisive rebuttal from me, armed with my meticulously researched knowledge of the bylaws and a smug, knowing smile. It was like watching a chess match where one side only had pawns and the other side had a castle, a knight, and a surprisingly effective bishop in the form of a local historical society. The HOA was powerless. Patricia Harding was defeated, and Castle Karen Slayer was here to stay. The end for Patricia Harding, the self-proclaimed queen of suburban aesthetics, the terror of non-conforming sheds, came not with a bang, but with a whimper. After weeks of frantic scheming, failed legal maneuvers, and increasingly desperate attempts to rally support, she finally broke. The weight of her defeat, the public humiliation, the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of her situation proved too much to bear. She resigned from the HOA, her letter of resignation a masterpiece of passive-aggressive self-pity. She blamed everyone but herself for her downfall, claiming she was the victim of a coordinated campaign of harassment, a neighborhood-wide conspiracy to undermine her authority, and a general decline in standards of decency and good taste. Nobody bought it. Her departure was met with a collective sigh of relief, followed by a spontaneous neighborhood celebration held naturally in the shadow of Castle Karen Slayer. The residents of Yellow Ridge, freed from her iron grip, rejoiced in their newfound freedom, their right to express their individuality, within reason, of course, without fear of HOA reprisal. Patricia's reign of terror was over, her legacy a cautionary tale whispered among the neighbors. Castle Cairnslayer, meanwhile, was thriving. It became a local landmark, a quirky tourist attraction, a symbol of the neighborhood's slightly rebellious spirit. People would drive from miles around just to see it, to take pictures, to pose in front of the imposing stone archway and the massive wooden gates. It became a popular backdrop for social media posts, graduation photos, and even a few, surprisingly tasteful, engagement announcements. The neighborhood children, of course, were the castle's biggest fans. They'd spend hours playing in and around it, pretending to be knights, dragons, and princesses. They'd stage mock battles, defend the castle from imaginary invaders, and generally treat my backyard like their own personal medieval playground. Local businesses started capitalizing on the castle's fame. A nearby bakery created castle cakes, miniature chocolate cakes shaped like turrets and decorated with edible silver frosting. A local gift shop started selling Castle Cairnslayer t-shirts featuring a cartoon image of the castle and a slightly unflattering caricature of Patricia. It was all utterly absurd, of course, but it was also wonderful. My act of petty revenge had inadvertently created a community hub, a source of neighborhood pride, and a constant reminder of the glorious downfall of Patricia Harding. The Yellow Ridge HOA, once a bastion of beige conformity and petty tyranny, underwent a dramatic transformation. The new leadership, hand-picked by me from the most laid-back and fun-loving residents, was focused on fostering community spirit, not enforcing ridiculous rules. The old bylaws, with their endless restrictions and regulations, were drastically revised. The emphasis shifted from maintaining a harmonious aesthetic to encouraging individual expression and celebrating the unique character of each home. And, in a final, glorious act of defiance against Patricia's legacy, I instituted a new annual tradition, the Shed of the Month contest. It was a celebration of creative landscaping, a showcase of backyard ingenuity, and a giant middle finger to the very concept of HOA-approved aesthetics. The first winner, unsurprisingly, was Castle Cairnslayer. Castle Cairnslayer was, obviously, made for Halloween, and so it became the annual location for the neighborhood's haunted house. The kids loved it, making their way through the safe dungeon and getting spooked by neighbors in costume. It was all a great success, with even the HOA getting involved in organizing rather than complaining. And so I remained the unlikely lord of my suburban castle, the accidental champion of architectural freedom. Castle Cairnslayer stood as a proud monument to my victory, a constant reminder that even the most powerful HOA could be defeated with a little bit of creativity, a lot of determination, and a healthy dose of petty revenge. It was a warm summer evening. I was sitting on a surprisingly comfortable lawn chair, positioned strategically near the entrance to my castle, sipping a glass of iced tea and watching the neighborhood kids play a spirited game of capture the flag in my backyard. A new neighbor, a young couple who'd just moved in down the street, walked by. "Excuse me," the woman said. "We're new to the neighborhood. We were just wondering, what's the deal with the medieval fortress in your backyard?" I smiled. "It's a long story," I said. "But the short version is, I had a disagreement with the HOA about a shed." They laughed, intrigued. "Well," the man said, "it's certainly unique." "It is," I agreed, "it is." Who knew that a simple shed and a burning desire for revenge could lead to all this? I guess sometimes you just gotta build a castle to find your peace, I thought, as I watched the kids run and laugh, their voices echoing through the twilight. It had been a ridiculous, over-the-top, and utterly unforgettable journey. I raised my glass in a silent toast. To Castle Karen Slayer, may it forever stand as a monument to the triumph of creative landscaping over conformity, and a warning to all future HOA tyrants.